Thank you. It's great to be here. Hello, Chicago. So I'm going to talk about a couple of projects from Cooper Hewitt. So hello from Cooper Hewitt. If you're in New York over the next couple months, you can come see my new show that just opened there, and I'll tell you about that shortly. I'm going to talk about a book that just came out in October, and I thought since this is a Humanities festival, I could tell you a little bit about how books come to be. And so they start, like all things, with a great emptiness, a void in your heart. And then you start to get a couple of ideas, and then you get more ideas, and more ideas. And then it starts to get interesting when you make connections between the ideas. And they're not just floating in the void, but they start to be some kind of constellation. And now you start to realize, okay, I may have something here. And then it's like crazy, like suddenly everything is connected to everything else. And you start to get worried when the Three Little Pigs and the Bauhaus, maybe this isn't so good. And then you throw in the Kennedy assassination. And this is when, as a writer, and I'm sure there's a lot of writers here, this is when you realize that you've been thinking too much and that you should probably start writing the book and not making all these crazy diagrams and reading and taking notes. And of course, when you're a writer, there are so many reasons not to write. Right, that's really the hard part. There's always an excuse, right? There's always a reason not to get up and actually write your book. But then there's a moment when you're actually doing it and you're in the process. And for me, it takes about 2 years to write a book. And the first year is amazing. Your book is so innocent. It's so full of promise and possibility. And then in the second year, your book is this very demanding, negative, time-sucking, money-wasting thing. And then finally, your book is born, and it is a blood-sucking monster. You realize that you have been pregnant for 2 years, and now your brain needs an episiotomy. Not a good thing, but you get over it, and if you're lucky, you get invited to speak at festivals and tell people about your book. And here it is. This is my book with a beautiful cover designed by my friend Jason Gottlieb, who got every one of those free-floating ideas onto the cover, including the Three Little Pigs and the Bauhaus. So I'm very happy about that. So what is a story? So there are many graphic tools that have been used by writers and dramatists as well as by designers to describe the action and shape of a story. So this comes really from Aristotle, and it was turned into a picture in the 19th century. And so here's how stories work. So they start out very quiet, and you have the introduction of a problem, and they build, and there's more and more energy, and you get to the top, and there it is, the climax of the story, and then you come down on the other side, kind of like a roller coaster. And Aristotle called this a whole action of a certain magnitude. So the story has a shape, it has an energy, it has an arc to it, and when it's over, you know it's over. You feel a conclusion, you feel a completion of this action. And the action has to be kind of worth doing. Designers actually use similar graphs to talk about problems and solving problems and conflict and resolving conflict. So this is one of the Three Little Pigs, and he's just purchased a security camera for keeping the wolf out of his house. And it all works out great for the little pig at the end. And it turns out that lots of things that human beings do and like have a shape like Aristotle's arc. So consider lunch. At the beginning, you smell the food. Let's say it's falafel, and it has this wonderful fried odor, and then you get to actually eat it, and it's really exciting, and you're in the moment, and then suddenly you feel awful. And it's a conclusion, and you feel good, and you know that you have finished your lunch. Sexual activity, when operating as planned, has a similar kind of arc. So it begins with some conversation. If I want to have relations with my husband, I don't just slap him on the face and push him up against the wall. I serve dinner and ask him about his day, and things build an interest, and they get better and better. And I feel like I need to talk to the scientist who made this graph and ask her about this Twin Peaks action going on here. Girlfriend, we need to talk. I need more information. And then it's over. And that's cool too, right? And in movies in the 50s, that was the part where people get out a cigarette and smoke. Now we get out our iPhones. And we're like, well, what happened in the last 12 minutes? I must know. So this idea of action is really interesting for designers, because as I'm a graphic designer, but I also work with product designers, service designers, architects, are often conveying an action to users. We might tell a story about that action, or we might invite the user to do something, to take an action themselves. So consider the act of throwing away a file on the desktop of your computer. This is an action that you take as an individual, and the designer of the interface of the computer has created a kind of Disney picture, an animated drama in which you see this file be selected and enter into the dreaded trash can, and there's an incredible sound effect that lets you know that you are the hero of this story. I have a little film of this so that you can really appreciate the richness of narrative scenography that has gone into this single, simple, micro interaction. And I'm going to play it twice, once in real time, and once slowed down so that you can appreciate it like the Super Bowl, where they do that slow motion thing. So hopefully that will play. Yeah. Now if my movie, yes, there it is. Is that coming? No. Juliana, what might help is that if these videos have played before, they won't play again. So if you close the file and open it again, it will play correctly. Bear with me a moment and think about how many actions you have performed today, enabled by design, whether it was turning on your car and hearing that incredible, satisfying sound of the whole vehicle firing up for your benefit. And maybe if you go directly to that page, then we don't have to hear your video again. Okay, we're getting there. And this is part of the action. This is called suspense. And this is where you sit there and wonder, will she ever show the video? And will it be worth it? And yes, it will be. Yes, if you go to that slide, and then we'll just go to the next one, the video should play. That's the other video that was supposed to play earlier, so we'll let that do its sound.
Welcome to the Chicago Humanities Festival and the Year of Rap.
It's okay.
Here are donors,
That's cool.
supporters, and
If you don't think it's awkward, I don't think it's awkward. We can just kind of make a deal there.
So if you're not already a member,
Okay. Here's my movie.
volunteers for helping make the festival come to life. The Chicago Humanities Festival believes that humanity thrives when people
You'll hear
gather
this sound on top of that sound.
And we hope that this will be your experience today. Download
Now,
our app
in
to
slow
explore
motion.
our programs and navigate
Look
our
at
festival.
all the animated cues that a designer has created to give you this feeling of throwing something away.
At this time. Thank you.
Okay, you got that. All right, it's beautiful. And of course, all of that is a fiction. There is no trash can. You have not thrown anything anywhere, right? You've just changed the address, the extension, the file name. But we have this feeling of tremendous satisfaction. I travel a lot. I go between Baltimore and New York City. And I hate the Amtrak interface. When you buy a ticket, you're choosing this, how many tickets do I want now, this really ugly list. Whereas on Southwest Airlines, when I choose how many tickets I want, I'm making this giant numeral change before my eyes, and it's very satisfying. It feels great. So look at this. This is so boring. I don't want to do this. It's bad typography. It's repetitive. It's redundant. Now this is good. Look at that. I mean, it's so exciting. And then I feel like, well, could I break this thing? Like, well, how many tickets could I buy? I mean, this is what happens if I have like 2 digits. Like, this could be super great. Anybody know who this is? This is Kurt Vonnegut, who went to graduate school at the University of Chicago. Yes, great. And there's a very famous video. You probably may have seen it, but you may not know its relationship to design. So when Kurt Vonnegut was a student at the University of Chicago, he had this theory that all stories could be charted as a kind of graph, but it was a little different from Aristotle's graph. It was a graph of emotion. And he felt that all stories could be charted as a change from misery to ecstasy, from feeling good to feeling terrible. And here's a little clip of Kurt Vonnegut.
A little above average is why get a depressing person. We'll start the whole thing. We call this story Man in Hole, but it needn't be about a man, and it needn't be about somebody getting into a hole. But it's just a good way to remember it. Somebody gets into trouble, gets out of it again. People love that story. They never get sick of it. All right, not copyrighted. Another story, also a beautiful curve and easily fed into a computer, called Boy Gets Girl, but it needn't be that. Just a way to remember it. Start on an average day, average person, not expecting anything to happen a day like any other. Find something wonderful, just loves it. Oh, God damn it.
And it's true, you can do that. And designers have kind of rediscovered Kurt Vonnegut's theory of literature and applied it to design and said that we can kind of map the experience that users have with products in terms of good and bad and fast and slow, and when they're waiting and when they succeed and when you have that feeling of satisfaction. And so these kind of journey maps are commonly used by designers to kind of chart out the experience that people have with products. So let's try this with the wonderful story of Cinderella. So at the beginning, Cinderella is very unhappy. She's at the misery part of the graph. She has nothing to wear. She can't go to the ball. So what does she do? She downloads the Fairy Godmother app. And this is great. And so we're going to look at her experience with the app is quite good, right? She loves the clothes. She loves the tiara. She's got a great ride to the ball. There's just one little problem, right? It's the curfew. She's got to leave the party at midnight. Bummer, fairy godmother. And so Cinderella is at the party, and it's getting to be close to midnight. And she runs down the stairs to the parking lot where the pumpkin is waiting for her, and she loses one of her stupid shoes on the steps. And right when it's time to get onto the thing, damn it, surge pricing. What a buzzkill. And so the designers back at fairygodmother.com, they're like, what are we going to do? We have to salvage our customer service ratings or Cinderella's going to drive us out of business. Like, this is terrible. So they come up with a solution, which is lost and found. So they use GPS. They completely violate Cinderella's privacy. They find her where she lives and bring her that shoe back. Best part, they make the driver pay for it. Excellent. And we all know what happens when Cinderella gets her shoe back. We have that satisfying end to the story. It's fantastic. What's that? Oh yeah, okay, so here's another pattern, right? The hero's journey. This is Joseph Campbell, the idea of the circle, the hero who has a call and then enters a special world and then returns home. When Aristotle thought about a hero, this is what came to his mind. For some of you, this may come to your mind, or maybe this, yeah, or this, or for me, it's always this, right? The one-armed heroine of Mad Max Fury Road. So how does this work? Do you guys have IKEA? Oh, yes. Okay, so do you ever feel like in IKEA you were trapped in a maze? Yeah, well, actually, I learned that IKEA is not a maze, it's a labyrinth. Okay? So a maze is a puzzle designed to get you lost. And you solve the puzzle by figuring out which turns to make. A labyrinth is a fixed path. So in a labyrinth, you have only one place to go, and the design tells you where to go. So labyrinths were actually part of medieval churches, and they were a kind of meditative practice that you could walk a great distance in a small space by following a path. And that's exactly what the hero's journey of IKEA is. So you enter from the parking lot into the big blue and yellow box, and you have this feeling of being in a new world, right? A new place. And then there's this path that is really controlling, right? Where you really can only go in one place. And then finally, you're, in the very depths of it. This path is like part of the design of the store. So there's this shiny part. That arrow is actually reflected on the floor with a special light. So if you walk under it or lie on the floor, the arrow's on your stomach. It's very exciting. You have to go past these kitchen vignettes in order to get the little armchair that you're trying to buy. There are secret passageways, escape routes that only the staff know. And at the end, there's this hot dog. The hot dog is so cheap, they're paying you to eat it. And that's because if you don't get that hot dog, you will die, like Jack Nicholson at the end of The Shining, who's in a maze, right? And they actually want to get you out of the store alive with your stuff. And that's why that hot dog is so cheap. So when I was working on this book about design and storytelling, there was a moment when I realized that what really connected all the dots from the Three Little Pigs to the Bauhaus was the idea of a path. And that what designers are creating is a path through physical space, through content, through architecture, or even graphically through an image, right? So the reason this image on the right is more narrative, feels like a story, is because it has a path that invites us to enter. Whereas the other image is like, it's flat, and it says, go away, right? And designers and artists have always known this. When I tried to find a picture of a forest that didn't have that narrative quality, I Google like big pictures of forests, and almost all of these have some kind of narrative sense to them. Like there's an important tree, or there's a path, or there's a waterfall in the distance, or God. Because these are the pictures that people like. So they're the ones that are most popular on Google. They're the pictures that have a kind of an invitation to enter, for the eye to enter. And designers do this all the time. And whether we're creating a landscape or a subway map, we're creating places for the eye to go. These are wonderful illustrations by Christoph Niemann. And we perceive this, we get the story, we get the joke of each image by reading them from top to bottom, right? We don't take it in all at once. It is a narrative that takes place over time. And everything designers create has some kind of invitation to travel, whether it's mentally or physically through the space. Okay, so I'm going to finish up by talking about my current exhibition at Cooper Hewitt. It's called The Senses, Design Beyond Vision. So I'm a museum curator, and museum curators tend to think that the only way people interact with art or objects is by looking at them. But really, we interact with things with smell, with sound, with touch. I thought it would be fun as a curator to make a stinky show, a scratch and sniff show, a place where people could interact in more dynamic ways than just looking. So right now you're sitting in a chair, and that chair is touching you in a very intimate way. You hardly know this chair, right? But you are experiencing it with special parts of your body. And actually, most of the design that we interact with, we interact in physical ways, not just looking. This is the book that we published with the show, designed by David Genko, and I haven't published a book in months, so I thought I should do a book with this exhibition too. And it's really lovely, and it's a lovely invitation to interact with the ideas around sensory design. This is a rendering of the exhibition designed by Wendy Evans Joseph. It is definitely a maze. I still haven't figured out how to get people efficiently through. It's a place of discovery, a place to get lost, a place where there is no final hot dog. So that's a little bit of the kind of sensory experience of this exhibition. It has walls made out of thread that you can touch and run your fingers through. It has objects that you can smell, objects that you can squeeze and scratch and feel. This is a wall made out of fur, synthetic fur, and when people touch the fur, it makes music. And there's something about a big furry wall that when you see it, you want to touch it. So it's a interface, an invitation to touch, and then there's this wonderful, delightful response that happens after that. This is called Snowstorm by Christopher Brogius, who's a perfumer, and it's a little room hung with wool snowballs that are scented to smell like winter. And Christopher says that winter smells like wool mittens and a frozen forest. So come to New York. In July, it'll smell especially amazing. And think about architecture. Every room has a unique smell. It has a unique sound. When we enter a room, we're not just entering a box, right? We're entering a sensory space that embraces us in different ways. I'm going to play you a little clip of some music that's had filters applied to it, reverb filters, that each one creates a sense of a different architecture to it. And the filters have names that are often reference a place. And this is by my friend Michelle Qureshi, who's in the audience tonight. Thank you, Michelle. that beautiful? So each of those bits of music creates in your mind a different kind of architecture. And that's done with software that changes the way the music sounds to give it the sense of echo or delay that comes from music playing in a real place. In my exhibition, we have a video called The Wicca Singer, in which this wonderful young man sings a song in different rooms and outdoors and indoors and in different places. And there's no reverb software used to change his voice. His voice is changed strictly by the space that he's in. I'm going to play you a short excerpt from that video.
Just give me a good delay to make my last words stay. Just give me a fast reverb to make my last words longer. I don't wanna leave alone in 9,000 years. No reverb will still exist, so I don't rise and feel it too dangerous. If death is not just a gossip, let me introduce you to the lawbreakers. Let me show you the revolutionaries, hidden with unspeakable. We want to reach grace.
This is so beautiful, isn't it? And so imagine, yes, that's very nice. Imagine composing a song with architecture, right? By changing the architecture. It's so fascinating. So sound can trigger us to have an image in our mind, even when there's no image there. So I'm going to play a short sound for you, and I want you to allow an image to enter. It's an image of a place, perhaps, that has a certain temperature, a certain humidity, even a certain quality of light. It's not Millennium Park, it's somewhere else. Isn't that beautiful, where you just went? Andy Thomas is a filmmaker and animator who takes sounds like those and visualizes them with animation software. And so he creates these very abstract animations that bring to mind or bring to vision a representation of the kind of life of that sound and the way any sound comes and goes. So if we think about a story as an action, right, an action that enters and leaves, Andy Thomas has this beautiful way of visualizing sound as something that comes and goes, that lingers, and he gives that an astonishingly abstract but alive visual form. So beautiful. So I'm really interested in how the senses interact. So sound and vision is one. Here's another one. This may be a little bit more of a stretch for you. Do you think you can associate a taste with a sound? I think so. I think we can try that. And it was my great pleasure to meet the scientists who did this experiment where they asked trained jazz musicians to create short improvisations in response to the basic categories of taste: salty, sweet, sour, bitter. And then they analyzed the results to look for patterns that were common. So they had individual musicians reacting to these tastes and what was common with them. So sour tastes tend to be very short with a high pitch and a very crisp distinction between the notes, whereas bitter tastes tend to be low and with a kind of soft differentiation between the notes. So you want to try it? You hungry? Okay. Lemon, lime, vinegar, coffee, chocolate, Earl Grey tea. Do you believe me? You like it? Science. Okay. But it's also art, and I want to share with you a little clip of Nina Simone from the wonderful biography of her, where she looks back at what she did with her voice, and she describes her voice by using the other senses. She refers to texture, but also to taste, as a way to get people to understand what she was doing with her voice. And now emotionally, we're moving into a kind of a dip, right? We're getting into a kind of deep, low part of the talk, and then we'll end on a high note. Okay.
What I was interested in was conveying an emotional message, which means using everything you've got inside you sometimes to barely make a note, or if you have to strain to sing, you sing. So sometimes I sound like gravel, and sometimes I sound like coffee and cream.
So baby, love me tonight.
Coffee and cream. So I love the way when we talk about sensation, we mix them all up, right? We build them together. And this is the way the brain works. So coming into dessert, when you see the word cinnamon, the same part of your brain goes off as if you were actually smelling or tasting cinnamon. And if the color is right, it's even better. And so designers, right, can manipulate us and put us in a sensory frame of mind with language and color and sound. And if the color is wrong, that sucks, right? That's like a kick in the pants. And that can be interesting too, right? To create conflict and surprise. And we often use color in very symbolic ways. I have an image on the screen of jelly beans. Just regular old Brock's jelly beans, which are sort of a semiotic system of fruit, right? And each one has a distinctive color, and those colors are often the only way you know that it's grape or lemon or lime or anything else as we make this connection. And designers often use preset color palettes that reference food and drink. So this is from the Adobe Illustrator software that anybody in here who's a designer knows this. When I'm thirsty or want a cocktail, I crack open my food and beverage palette from my Illustrator software and pour myself a nice martini. And of course, the language is part of it. The language builds the association. If I change the language, then the effect is really different. And I was showing this slide at another talk, and someone said, well, what's going on with that? I was like, oh my gosh, well, I have a 7-pound Chihuahua mix named Kevin. And Kevin is so special that he shits vanilla. I'm not kidding you, it's true. So in our exhibition, please come this summer to New York and see it. There's all kinds of things to touch and smell. It's accessible to all people, including visually impaired people and people with hearing impairments. And we're really trying to create an environment that invites everyone to experience multiple senses. On the screen now is some furniture designed to look like cake and pastries, using color and texture to evoke a kind of passion for sugar, or spoons that are designed to stimulate your mouth, right? And we think about taste as being all about aroma and flavor, but actually it's 90% texture, and you know it. So these wonderful spoons have little blobs and pimples and raised edges that make your mouth feel excited. It's kind of great. You can't actually put them in your mouth in our show, but we have one that you can touch with your fingers. So I'll end with this, a little manifesto about sensory design. At Cooper Hewitt, we want all designers to create products and environments that are inclusive to people, that speak to people through multiple senses, that are poetic and full of pleasure, and that also solve human problems. So please join us at Cooper Hewitt, and it was my great pleasure to join you in Chicago. So thank you very much.
We'll take a few questions. We have some microphones roving around here, so if you have a question, raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. All right, looks like you killed him.
Okay. Oh, usually one person has a question and then the floodgates are open.
In the back there. There you go.
So I appreciate that you play with the senses. I've been trying for a long time, and so I'm marveling at the experiments that you've discovered. What I'm curious about is why we can't, I mean, there's a lot of new technology out there all the time. There's been people who've played with like walking down a hall and having different aroma spurt at you. There's some interesting things that happen in New York, some advertisers who've done some crazy stuff, but it's very, very limited. We tend to be exclusively virtual, and now that we're all phone-centric, it's pretty hard to figure out how we're going to get that sniffer on our phone, right? The taste activators, et cetera. So I just was curious as to where. Well,
it was certainly a big challenge for us in our museum, because museums really don't want people to touch anything. And the reason for this is that museum goers are animals, and they do actively. The show's been open 2 weeks, and the maintenance problems are immense. Because people come into a museum, they just want to break everything. It's like, oh, there's a button. How hard can I push it? Oh, here's a piece of china. Can I smash it? Is glass fragile? They answer these empirical questions quite quickly. But museums weren't always like that, and actually, historically, museums felt that people had to be able to touch things to really understand them. But because today museums are so huge and admit so many people, we really have to control behavior. So we've found all kinds of interesting ways to introduce smell into the museum, including the first ever scent fountain, which is a beautiful machine created by a scientist at NYU in collaboration with a perfumer. And it's really cool because it solves the problem of if you have scent shooting up into the room, it will very quickly fill the entire room and drive everyone away. So you need a way to send it up and then bring it back down, which is what fountains do with water. So we solved that problem. It's a fundamental human problem, the scent fountain. And we devised various ways to introduce scent in a museum setting. And it's part of the design challenge of our museum. Yeah, over here.
Do we need more sensory design because we're having a sensory design deficit the same way we have a nature design deficit now?
I think we do. I think that as people become more and more digital, our society becomes more, there's a term for it, ocular-centric, which means revolving around the eye and having a kind of domination of the eye. And I think that's a very bad thing, and that the world is much more exciting when we admit other senses into our realm of what's interesting and what's important.
Thank you for your talk. Regarding the book Storytelling, does it look at like contemporary narratives like deconstructivism and fracturing it and memory where things are not linear, but it's fractured?
I don't really address those particular theories. I have another book that does that from some time ago. But it does look at nonlinear types of narrative because, for example, think of a subway map. It's something that people have to find their way through multiple journeys, not through just one path. But I don't really address that in particular. It's a great topic and something I've written about more in my books on typography, which address the text more specifically as opposed to products or services. Great question, though.
And on this side over here, and then I'll get to that.
Do you see sensory design helping contribute to learning? You know, if you pick up something,
absolutely,
you know,
absolutely.
And how do you do that from a design perspective, other than go out in the woods and pick up all the slimy stuff?
Well, it's interesting. Henry Dreyfuss, who is one of the founders of modern industrial design, he designed a clock, a wonderful clock called the Big Ben alarm clock. And he did user testing. He stood behind the counter in a department store, and he watched customers pick up his clock and pick up a different clock. And his clock was too light. And so people thought it was cheap, and they bought the heavy clock instead. And he only learned that by actually observing people interact with his product. He went back to the studio and made the clock heavier. And so we actually perceive a lot of value and a lot of information from touching things that we may not be consciously analyzing, but designers need to observe that and understand what people really get from these richer interactions with the world. And I think for students, you know, to only sit and hear a teacher talk is known to be less compelling than actually touching and manipulating and doing in a more physical way.
And so have you started playing around at all with any of the AR or VR, augmented reality or virtual reality as it relates to sensory design?
Yeah, a lot of augmented reality, and you can do on your phone now, you know, so we can all play with it. It tends to be visually oriented. So a real virtual reality experience gives you like sensations of vertigo and sensations of being surrounded, you know, by a kind of richer sensory world that isn't just visual. But the simpler things that we do on our phone tend to be strictly visual. And I think they'd be a lot more interesting when they make the phone vibrate and shake and make sound. It makes it more inclusive and more real, right? Less of just a picture. Okay, I'd be happy to answer other questions later. Okay, thank you very much. It was fun.